So what I've designed is for you to go through this is experience and listen to my presentation and be documenting some of your thinking as you're going through this to learn a bit more about transmediation since you've been reading about that this week. I've whittled down some of the major points about transmediation that are found in articles that you're not reading this semester. It's the process of translating meaning from one sign system to another. So, for example, from language into a pictorial representation. So, in some ways, this presentation right here is very much an example of transmediation. I am taking information found in one sign system and putting it in another. At this particular moment, it's mostly linguistic based, but there are portions of spatial layout and whatnot, as well as the fact that I'm animating by adding different pieces to it. This process promotes thinking that is really helping students to develop new meanings and connections that may not be possible if you remain just in a linguistic format. You really need, as a person engaging in transmediation, need to think about how to translate this content into a different sign system. How can you represent the main idea of what you're thinking about a text into a different content, a different sign system? And transmediation can promote reflective thinking as well as this generative thinking of these new meanings and new connections. Sahor talked about literal and imaginative transmediation. Literal would be where you parallel content in one sign system into another. For example, if you retell the plot in a comic book format where the small boxes delineate parts of the story, it's still inventing different connections that was not previously available to the students. So it's still an important process, even though I would really be more interested in these imaginative transmediation ideals where you're looking at metaphoric and symbolic representation. So it's not necessarily the one-to-one matching of the text to content. I think I've talked about this a little bit before. Literal transmediation might be if you're reading or talking about a poem and you see a bee buzzing in the poem because that's what it talks about. That would be quite literal. Imaginative might involve more of a thematic analysis. What are the major themes? How can you represent the theme? So if you see a theme in a text and it's really talking about the power of love and family, and you perhaps create a representation that involves your own family, that would be more of an imaginative transmediation process because that's connecting it back into your own personal life. And this transmediation process really does promote this metaphoric and analogy thinking process with students. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a picture. And with the form that I sent you, I want you to jot down some ideas. I don't want you to worry about whether or not your idea is correct. Please don't go back and fix it. It's not really worth it in the grand scheme of things. I really just want to see kind of your thinking process as you go through this experience. So jot down what you believe this photograph represents. If you need a little bit more time, you can pause it here. In this moment, we're now moving on to the second portion, we'll call it the second photograph. What I'm telling you is this is a representation of a war. Please feel free to add any information you might change now based on that information. Again, feel free to pause if you need to. And now I'm telling you this is a representation from World War II. So what do you feel that this is representing? Again, jot down your thoughts, please. And if you need more time, go ahead and pause. This is the linguistic information that worked with this display at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The Air and Sea Armada, with more than 11,000 aircrafts, 6,000 naval vessels, and 2 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen from 15 countries, the invasion force assembled for Overlord was the greatest in history. Not all of these forces were deployed on June 6th. Many arrived as reinforcements after initial landings. Winston Churchill called Overlord the most difficult and complicated operation that has ever taken place. So then we're going to go into a little bit more information about the Air Armada and then sea. On June 6th, the sky over the English Channel swarmed with transport planes, gliders, bombers, and fighters. Bombers targeted German supply lines across northern France and patrolled the coast, watching out for enemy forces. Over 1,000 fighters flew directly above the convoys to protect them from the Luftwaffe attack. Although the presence of the fighter escorts reassured the seaborne troops, some fighters were shot by nervous gunners who mistook them for German planes. As it turned out, the Luftwaffe was virtually absent on D-Day. Allied forces controlled the skies. The Sea Armada. With nearly 5,000 vessels, the invasion fleet deployed on June 6th was an inspiring and impressive sight. An American bomber pilot looking down at the fleet observed, "We could see the battleships firing at the coast, and literally you could have walked, if you took big steps, from one side of the channel to the other. There were that many ships out there." But the sight of the approaching armada terrified the Germans stationed on the coast. One German officer marveled, "It's impossible. There cannot be that many ships in the world." So take a moment and just write down any thoughts you have based on this information that you've now received linguistically about that original visual. And again, if you need more time to jot, feel free to pause. And I'm re-showing you this picture again to illustrate kind of this point of this recursive transmediation process. So any final thoughts you have about this entire experience I've just given you, please jot them down now. And again, feel free to pause if you need a little bit more time. So what you're going to be experiencing, especially when you get into your reader response project, your multimodal response, is this connection that I'm advocating for between transmediation and reader response theory. For those of you that may not know reader response theory, Louise Rosenblatt is really where I'm coming from, focusing on a transactional experience of text where the reader and the text and the context in which that text is read is very important. But also the transaction indicates that it's a recursive process between the text, the meaning that you're creating as you're reading the text, but then also the process of creating a product, and then the meaning that resides after you finish that process and product. So you'll notice this is actually a representation of transmediation from a former student. Originally, her design only indicated from the book to each of these pieces, like the little boy holding the film sign, the mathematics. And through our conversations, we determined it would be best to really represent the idea of meaning changing through this process of transmediation by the arrows going back to the book, thinking really about that meaning and what someone is getting out of the book. An example from one of my classes in graduate school, we read a print text, which in this particular case had a lot to do about kids not having an opportunity to interact with technology. And so we remixed the design with the Hunger Games and really talking about how not allowing students to interact with technology was a form of oppression. And this is obviously our representation. You don't have to agree with it, and it may not make a whole lot of sense because you weren't present in that conversation. But just an example of, even if you're not reading a narrative text, there are lots of opportunities to engage in this type of a transmediation experience. So hopefully this will help you to really kind of understand transmediation a little bit better before you dig in and really have to work on these major projects in the next couple of weeks.